Tonight's topic is about Introduction to Web APIs. My name is Jay Wengro. I'm the founder and CEO of Actualize Coding Bootcamp. And tonight, you're going to get introduced to something called Web APIs. If you've never heard of an API before, that's okay. If you don't know how to code, that's also okay. This is a high-level overview of what Web APIs are. So you may have heard of APIs before. APIs actually stand for Application Programming Interface. However, most people don't call it that. They just call it APIs. So what are APIs and why are they useful? So the truth is that APIs are actually quite magical. What is that music? Chris, do you hear that music?
What music?
I don't know. I'm hearing this music. Okay. Anyway, we'll just proceed. So web APIs are a concept as follows. When you go to the internet, which I will do, I'm going to share my screen right here. And here I'm at a website called CodePen.io, which is a website that we will use. But the point, before we even go ahead and use it, when I go to CodePen.io or any website, I go to this URL. If you can see it, it's up here in the top, what I call the URL bar of the browser. And this URL, when you type it into your browser and hit enter, then a web page appears on your screen. What's going on under the hood is that the URL goes into the internet. It goes into some computer somewhere. It triggers what's called a request from a server. So a server is just a fancy name for a computer. So when you type in CodePen.io, it goes to the server or the computer of CodePen organization. And that server gives back code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And your browser takes that and makes this really nice looking web page that your browser shows you. Now, the concept of an API is that not in every case does a server have to return a web page to your browser. You could actually use the internet, not just to get web pages, but you could use the internet to get plain old information, what I call raw data. We're going to see why this is useful in just a moment, but let me show you what on earth I'm talking about. So I'm going to Google Harry Potter API. And as you see, there are a number of links that come up. I'm actually going to click on the second one, the HP-API. Here it says, welcome to the HP API. And this is a regular web page. But you'll notice that there's a number of links here. I'm going to click on one of these links. And instead of getting a web page back in our browser, if you look very carefully, I'm going to sort of zoom in here, we just get words and numbers and just characters. This is raw information. It's raw data. Now, it's really hard to look at this data in your browser. It looks like gobbledygook. To make this easier, we're actually going to go ahead and install, I'm using Google Chrome here, and we're going to install a Chrome extension that will help us look at this data better. So I'm going to Google JSON formatter Chrome. And the first link that comes up here is JSON formatter. It is a Chrome extension, which is a extension of the browser that I'm using. I'm going to go ahead and add this to Chrome. It says, do you really want to add this? I really do want to add this. Okay, it has been added to Chrome. Now, if I go back to this first tab, if I go back to this API, and I refresh the page, you'll see that this data becomes much more organized and much easier to read. Let's look at it carefully. If we look carefully, we see that we have a list of seemingly, it's a list of characters from the Harry Potter story. We could see that we have this thing here called name. And then it says Harry Potter. Species, he's a human. Gender, male. House, Gryffindor. Date of birth. I had no idea that was his birthday. Interesting. He has green eyes. He has black hair. It even has data about his wand. This is very, very intense stuff. It has his Patronus and other information. It even has the actor who plays it in the Harry Potter film. And he's still alive, thank goodness. So this is, if you look at carefully, we have these curly braces here. Everything from that I'm highlighting here, from this top curly brace to this lower curly brace, is all the information about Harry Potter. If we move on, we'll see that the next character listed is Hermione Granger. And once again, it has her name, her species, and her gender, and her house, et cetera, et cetera. Did you know that Hermione is older than Harry? Apparently so. She's older than me too, which I didn't think would be the case. We've got Ron. We've got many people and some characters that I probably don't remember from the book or the movie. But what you see here is that this is just plain information. It's not a web page. It's not a page that looks pretty. It's not something you could even interact with. It's just data. It's just plain information. So what a web API is that instead of when going in your browser and you enter a URL, instead of getting back a web page, which is what you're used to when you browse the internet, instead you're getting back raw information, raw data. We'll see why on earth this is useful momentarily. First, do you have any questions, Chris, from the audience?
Nope, we are perfectly fine.
Okay. So moving on, I am going to show you how, first let me unshare my screen. So let's talk a little bit further about why APIs are actually useful in real life. So an API, when I'm creating software, when I'm creating a web page, if I want to get data that's out there from across the internet, I can do so using a web API. So let's say I'm creating a website about Harry Potter, and I want to feature information about the characters. How do I get that information about the characters onto my website?
Gryffindor!
Oh my, what on earth? Oh, don't do that. Oh, man. Sorry, okay. Basically what I was saying was that if I was making a web page that is about, a website that's about Harry Potter and features the various characters, then I can get that information from a web API. Now, you might be thinking that this is not too useful because perhaps you're not interested in making a website about Harry Potter. However, I can show you that web APIs are useful for all sorts of information. One other example of APIs in real life is in regards to the weather. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen once again. And I'm going to Google Weather API. And we get a bunch of links here for weather APIs. There are multiple weather APIs. I'm going to click on this third link here, the Yahoo Weather API. Remember Yahoo? So they still have a weather API, apparently. When I click on it, this is a confusing looking website. It's basically a website for programmers, for developers, for them to understand how to use the Yahoo Weather API. Now, I'll just show you how we use it since I've looked at this website before. There's a URL right here, which I'm going to copy and paste into my browser. And this, I'm going to zoom in. This is the weather in GNOME. You probably don't know, you may not be familiar with GNOME. Let's instead find the weather for Chicago, which is where I'm located. So if you look really, really carefully in this URL, we can change the city in which we want to get weather data. So if you look carefully, I'm highlighting the word no. And I'm going to instead change that to Chicago. And I'm also going to change the state to Illinois. And I'm going to hit enter. And now this is the weather data about the weather in Chicago. So this information is a little harder to understand than the Harry Potter API. But if you look carefully, we can see some various bits of useful information. So here we could see there's a title, and it says Yahoo Weather, Chicago, Illinois. If we scroll down, we could find information about the wind, chill, direction, and speed. We can, let's get the temperature, how about? So if you look really carefully, right over here, there's this thing here that says temp and 47. So it is currently 47 degrees Fahrenheit in Chicago, and it's also cloudy. And this is very useful if you're in a room like I'm in, where there's no windows, and I, from my computer, can tell you what the weather is. Now, of course, you could do that on a website, but with an API, I can build a website that shows you the weather in Chicago or in any other place, which is a very, very powerful thing. So we are going to show you a real life example of a website that uses an API. But instead of showing you the Harry Potter API or the weather API, we're going to show you a really cool thing. There's many cities have what's called an open data portal. It's basically a form of API. If I go to, we're going to start with Chicago, and I'm going to Google Chicago Open Data. And right here, up top, we have a City of Chicago data portal. I'm going to click on that. And it's a website that features all the different types of APIs that you can see about data about the city of Chicago. So there's all sorts of useful information in the various APIs featured here. They have, there's an API that shows you the salary of every individual by name who works for the city. So you can see the mayor's salary, you can see the sanitation worker's salary, you can see everyone's salary by name, because that is public data officially. I found something, there's many different things you can find here. I found a few interesting things that we can look at. So not everyone has easy access to information, to books, to internet. And of course, libraries are great places to get that for people. And the city of Chicago in particular has a program called Connect Chicago, which is special hotspots throughout the city that allows for free Wi-Fi for the residents of Chicago. So I'm going to search for Connect Chicago. I'm going to click Connect. I'm going to click here on Connect Chicago locations. And this link is the next one I'm going to click on. And here we can see Connect Chicago is a loose network of more than 250 places in the city where internet and computer access, digital skills training, and online learning resources are available. I'm going to show you the API for this. But before that, we have a question. Chris.
Yes, Andy asks, how would we know which API would be the one we need if we find more than one of them for the same type of information?
Yeah, so you have to, so the question is, what if you find two similar looking APIs for the same data set, for the same information? The answer is that, well, it's possible that either API will work. Honestly, you just have to look at each API, you try those URLs out, see the information that you get back, and see which of those gives the proper information. So I've already done this research, so I know that this particular API is the one that we want to work with. Now, to actually get to the URL that is the API for Connect Chicago locations, at least on this website, it takes us a few steps. Let me just walk you through that. So if we click on this button that says API. It says access this data set via the SODA API. That's their fancy name for it. And then right here is the URL that we want to use. In fancy terminology, it's called the API endpoint, as you can see over here, but it's really just a URL that gives you back raw data instead of a website. Again, that's a web API. So I'm going to copy and paste that special URL in here. And apparently it's a lot of data, so it took my computer a few seconds to format it properly. I'm going to zoom in so it could be a little easier to read. I honestly don't know what all of this information represents. So for example, there's something here called the computed region 43 blah, 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 blah. I don't know what that is. Presumably there's someone who does. But you could see here a useful piece of information, an address. So 49 East 95th Street in Chicago is a place where you can find a Connect Chicago location. Here we have a friendly description about it, the hours that it's open. It even has the internet download and upload speed, so that's pretty fascinating. It has the latitude and longitude. So these coordinates here, that is the exact geographic location in terms of latitude, longitude, where this exists. Now what's really cool about this is that if I just gave you a list of all the Connect Chicago locations, it would be somewhat difficult for you to find what's the nearest one near me. But imagine we can take all these locations and put them on a map. Then it's much more easy to visualize which Connect Chicago locations are near you or the people who need it. So I'm going to show you a web page that I created that utilizes this web API and puts these pieces of data on a map. So this is a short link that I have in front of me that I'm just copying here. It's a bit.ly link to capital G, A9, lowercase g, Q, F. And that brings me to this really interesting CodePen. CodePen is a site where you can write code on the top and it shows you the resulting web page on the bottom. So before we look at the code, let's look at the resulting web page. What we have here in front of us is your good old Google map. But in the Google map, it has all the locations for these Connect Chicago centers. So if I go ahead and click on one of these push pins, we can see that it has the name of that location. So in this case, it's the West Englewood Library, and it has the address. And the same, I could click on all the various push pins and get those pieces of information. So this is really, really, really cool. Now let me show you the code for this. So I don't expect you to understand this code at this time, but I'm going to highlight certain points of the code where you can see that we're utilizing the web API. So if you'll recall, this very URL here, let me make this a little bigger so you can see it better. See where it says URL, and then it has this actual URL spelled out, HTTPS, et cetera, et cetera. This was the very same URL that, I'll just show it to you again. This was the same URL we just looked at. This is the data API that has all the information about the Chicago Connect locations. So our code basically says, hey, we want to show the user on our webpage, we want to show them a map of all those locations. So we're going to grab, this is the key of this whole lesson. We're going to grab this data from the web API across the internet and use that data in our website. How cool is that? So our website, we don't have to, when we write the code for this website, we don't have to type in or create a database that has all the entire list of Connect Chicago centers. We just grab it from this URL. So by grabbing it from that URL, we take all that information and use that on the map. So let me show you some other interesting points here. So let's go back to the actual URL. if we look carefully, the coordinates that I pointed out were the latitude and longitude. But the truth is that they also have the same data spelled out here. And this is what we're going to focus on right now. So latitude is 41.72, yada, yada, yada. The longitude is negative 87.62, yada, yada, yada. Since in the API, it says these terms, what are actually called keys, these keys, latitude and longitude, in our code, we reference those data points. So right here on line 12, we're referencing the latitude and the longitude. Now, if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see mentions of latitude and longitude once again, but you'll also see a reference to this, to organization name, and a reference to address. What is the organization name and the address? Well, let's go back to our API. So here's organization name. So of one of the Chicago Connect centers, the organization name is the Abbott Park Senior Satellite Center. And the address is 49 East 95th Street. So that information is the information from the API that we're using to populate these info boxes. So when I click on an info box, it's grabbing this data from the API. It's taking the organization name from the API and putting it in this bold section of the info window. And then it takes the address and puts it in this subsection of the info window. So from the API, we basically take this raw data from someone else's URL across the internet, and we take these different data bits. We take these, we take the latitude, longitude, the organization name, the address, and we can use that information to create an amazing website that's actually really, really useful to people. Any questions, Chris? No? Is it that simple? Okay, well, feel free to ask Chris any questions via our chat. Okay. Next up, we are going to explore another facet of the Chicago Open Data Portal. And you can actually Google to see if there's an open data portal for your city where you live. I Googled some random cities the other day and I found that each of them had an open data portal, which is really, really cool. I checked Nashville and London, and it's really cool that these cities are allowing for their information to be publicly used in an API, which allows other people to make websites and other software that utilizes that really important data. So let's talk about another one of everyone's favorite subjects, and that is potholes. So I don't know about you, but in Chicago, Chicago is somewhat notorious for its potholes. Wouldn't it be cool to get a map that warns me where all the potholes are? I would say that 4 times a year, I get a flat tire due to potholes. But if I had a map that could show me in advance where the potholes are, that would save me a lot of time, money, and grief. So let's go to back to the Chicago Open Data Portal. So I'm going to Google that again, Chicago Open Data. And I am going to search for potholes.
Slytherin!
Oh my God, stop that, sorting hat. Sorry. Okay, potholes. Going from one frustrating thing to the next. So if I look at potholes, there's 41 results. So I can see potholes patched, which that's not so interesting to me. I want to know where the potholes actually are. So this is an API that's super useful. The 311 service request, potholes reported. So for every pothole reported, that goes into the API, and then I can actually take that data and put it on a map. Chris, you have a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's see. Laurel says, I've heard of RESTful API. What is that?
Yeah, RESTful API. So there's a concept of a RESTful API. That is a little difficult to explain in this setting. However, the short answer is that let's look, let me just go back to this API right here. Who decided how this information should be formatted? Meaning, who decided that for the Chicago Connect Centers, there's going to be an address and a city and hours and all this other gobbledygook? Who decided that this should be the URL? Why is it QU9K dash whatever? So when people make APIs, they can make them however they want. What RESTful conventions, what a RESTful API is it's a system, it's an arbitrary made up system that basically says, hey everyone, when you make your API, let's follow a specific set of conventions. Let's always make it that when you make a URL for an API, it always looks like this. Let's make it that when your API gives back a specific data set, it's formatted in that specific way. And by having a uniform formatting across multiple APIs, it makes working with APIs much easier. If every API has a completely different URL structure and the way in which the data is formatted, it's much more difficult to jump from one API to the next. Is that helpful? Does that make sense? Okay. Another question? Yeah.
Yeah. Andy asks, what is the process of integrating the data from these APIs into our web apps?
Yeah, so if I go back, well, let me bring up the Pothole app in a second, and then we'll cover it there. So let's click on this. And we're going to click on API. We're going to grab that link and paste it into our browser. We'll wait a moment for it to load. I guess there's a lot of potholes. Okay, so each pothole gets its own set of curly braces here. And it's amazing how much data there is about a pothole. So we have the zip code of the pothole. And that's actually, my in-laws live in that zip code, so I should probably warn them right after this show. It has the address, the latitude, the longitude, status is open. I don't think it means the pothole is open. It probably means that the request is open. Police district, whatever, X coordinate. I don't even know what the X coordinate is. Okay, but that's what it is. So each one of these is data about a pothole. So to be given a list of potholes is completely useless. It's much more helpful if we can visualize the potholes on a map. So I'm going to go to another bit.ly link, which brings us to CodePen. And it's going to be 2UMBX0N. After the show, I'll email all of you the list of links. So, okay. So here we have the list. Here's the map of the potholes in Chicago. Now, this looks like relatively few potholes. And the truth is that this is not all the potholes in Chicago, and I'll explain that in a moment. But to answer Andy's question, the way we go about integrating these APIs into our code is, well, first of all, you have to know how to code. So in this case, all this code is written with JavaScript. But by running this special code that's called Ajax, and by putting in this URL, which was the URL of our data set, well, that's the wrong data set. Here, let me copy that link, put it here. By taking that very URL and mentioning it in our code, that allows our code to grab that data from that API. Does that answer the question? Well, does Andy have a response?
He says yes.
Okay, great. So yes, at the end of the day, you do need to know how to code. By the end of this lesson, it's not something you're going to learn, but this is an overview of getting a sense of what web APIs are and the power that they have. Okay, let me show you something interesting. So I'm going to go back to the Chicago Open data. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit. If we go, let's see, I'm going to click on tutorial. That's not what I want. I want, okay, if you go to the footer, you'll see it says API documentation. That's basically instructions for the coder how to use the API. So I'm going to click on that. And again, if you're not a programmer, some of this will seem like gobbledygook. Most of it will seem like gobbledygook. However, I want to point out some interesting thing. So I'm going to click here on this link that says API docs. And I'm going to click on this section that says simple filters. So basically, when creating an API, when people make APIs, they often put some flexibility into them. So it's probably simpler if I just show you this in the API itself. So, well, let me show you this example. So here, the core API is this, the core URL is this bit here, soda.demo.socrata.com, blah, 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 up until the question mark. That's the raw API. However, there are additional options you can throw into the URL. So by putting information after the question mark, that allows you to filter the data, or maybe sort the data in a specific order. So I'll show you this in our example. So if you look carefully at the URL here, you'll see it also has a question mark. I don't have to put that question mark there. This is the raw data. That is the core URL. I'm going to put it here. You'll see we get back all of our nice potholes in raw form. So, however, this is a lot of potholes. If I wanted, I could add some of these extra options at the end of this URL. So one example of these special options is if I put in question mark $ limit equals, let's say 5, then I will only get back the top 5 potholes. What makes them the top 5 potholes? It's probably the first 5 stored in their database. But if you look, there's just 5 potholes in this whole bit of information. How did I know that I was able to do this question mark $ limit equals 5? Is that something that works in all APIs? And the answer is that no, it doesn't work in all APIs. The creator of the API is the person who dictates how the API is going to work. How did I know that the Chicago Open Data Portal API had this option of limiting the number of potholes I get back? That is something that I gained from this API documentation. By clicking on these various sections. So here's where I learned about the limit thing. So if you look carefully here, it talks about the $, limit. Now again, if you're not a coder, at first this is like total gobbledygook. But once you understand how to use APIs, you can understand this documentation and learn how to use it and all of its options. So in my example here, I had initially put a limit of 100 because I was nervous about that the map might explode if I take off the limit. I'm going to see what happens when I take off the limit, and I'm going to run it. Now the problem, okay, that actually wasn't so bad after all, was it? Sometimes when you load a lot of data from an API, your website can go really, really slowly, or maybe even like crash. In this case, it didn't. This, my friends, is the real Chicago. This is what I go through. This is what I drive through every day. This is why I get 4 flat tires every year. So after looking at this map, I think I'm gonna start taking the train. Okay, you have a question? Yes.
Yes, we have a question that says, these are all web APIs. Can non-web tools, libraries, etc., also have APIs? Any examples?
Yeah, so great question. Can only websites access these web APIs is how I understand the question. So the answer is, it's not limited to that. So in this case, I've created a website that accesses the web APIs. However, you can write other software that grabs data from web APIs as long as the data is being run on a device that has internet access. So an example is, let's say, a mobile app. Many of the mobile apps that you use are not necessarily working with like an internal database, but they're getting their information that they're displaying in the app, they're grabbing that from a web API. So since your phone has internet access, the app is able to do that. If you put your app on airplane mode, then those APIs would be cut off and your app wouldn't function properly. So yes, anything can grab data from a web API as long as that device has access to the web. Great question. Yeah.
And then, are there other examples of how to visualize JSON data besides on a Google map, like statistical data? Any easy to use in code tools?
Yes. So are there other types of visualizations besides viewing things on a map? So in these examples, obviously, these are geographic kinds of data, and therefore it makes sense to view them on a map. But you can take any web data and use any, as long as you know how to code, you can use any sort of data visualization tool to view that data. So you can take the weather data, for example. Let's say you wanted to see the weather forecast for Chicago. You can show that like in the form of like a bar graph or something like that. See the temperature trends in Chicago. As long as you know how to code and make bar graphs. But yes, you can take that web API, take its data, and populate any sort of graph with it. You can do anything with a web API. You can, as long as you know how to code, you can display any sort of visualization that you want. Cool. Okay, one more example for now. And I mean, you're understanding the power of the APIs. With APIs, you can create a web app, a mobile app that has data from anywhere. So let's talk about crime. So if you've been following this past presidential election, Chicago was singled out for its crime. So let's actually go ahead back to our Chicago Open Data Portal. And we can see, I'm going to search for crime. And here is a data set called Crimes 2001 to Present. That's presumably a lot of crime. So let's go to the API. Let's see what that looks like. I'm copying and pasting that URL. And each crime, so from here to here, is data about a single crime. So we can see that the primary type of crime was theft. We can see when it took place. So it took place March 19th at, I guess that'd be 11:50 p.m. It says that it's a retail theft from a small retail store. It says which block it's on. It has, most importantly for our purposes, it has the latitude right there and the longitude. Now, here is a battery that took place in an alley. It's not healthy to look at all this. However, we're going to visualize this on a map. Now, if you visualize this on a map in terms of pushpins, the map would just be pushpins. It would be useless data. However, another form of data visualization on a map is we can use what's called a heat map, where we have higher concentrations of these criminal events, there will be a deeper color on the map. So let's go to the following URL, bit.ly to capital D X Y S K 1. And here we see, if you look carefully, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Still not what I wanted to do. There we go. So if I zoom out a little bit, so this is data. So this is Lake Michigan. No crime in Lake Michigan. However, there's lots of crime in Chicago. And you can see that this section right there is red because there are many instances of crime in that API that take place in that geographic area. So this is another, although it's, again, it's a map, but it's a different type of visualization. Since I know how to code, I'm able to make a heat map. But where do I get this data from? I don't have it. I grab it from the Chicago Open Data Portal API. If we look, in our code, we are simply referencing the latitude and longitude because we're just, in this case, we're not analyzing the types of crime. We just care about the actual occurrences of them, and we plot them on the map and generate a heat map as a result. Okay, we have questions? Yes.
You mentioned that fetching data from an API can slow down your web application. Do you have any suggestions for speeding up the fetching of large amounts of data?
Yeah, so the question is that given that at times when grabbing data from an API, your website might slow down depending on how much data you're gathering, are there ways to speed it up? So it all depends on, there's various tips and tricks, and it depends on your situation. So examples of tricks that you may use is that you may be creating a piece of software that doesn't necessarily need all the data in one fell swoop, but it can get it in various chunks. So let's say you're creating the list of all the employees in Chicago. So if you were to grab all the employees in Chicago, let's say there's 1 million employees that work for the city, let's just say your website would be too slow. What you can do is build your web page so that it loads, let's say, the first 100, and then when you scroll down, as you scroll down, it grabs the next 100. And you've seen sites like that, right, where you scroll down and only then does it load the data. Like on Twitter, it doesn't show you all the tweets. It shows you the first bunch of tweets. As you scroll down, and then it loads the next bunch of tweets. And the reason they're doing that is exactly for this reason. They don't want to load all the tweets at once. That's too much data. But they basically grab smaller chunks of data as you need it. That's one way that people get around that issue. Another way some people get around that issue is that if there are pieces of data that that your software is constantly getting, it might actually just temporarily save that in its own database for a temporary period of time, so that it doesn't always have to keep on grabbing it from the internet. So again, there's various tips and tricks, and it all depends on your situation. Not all tricks will work for the type of software that you're trying to build. So in our example, here it would be pretty tough to make a heat map if I was only grabbing 100 crimes at once. Here I sort of do need to grab them all at once. So thankfully it wasn't too much data. But there are various tips and tricks, and that comes with expertise. Chris, do you have any more questions?
Yeah. What's it look like if the API you reference is down or gone?
Yes. So although APIs are magical and powerful, they can certainly lead to problems. So you are wholly dependent on the API. If the API is down, then your website will be down or not function properly. So there are pros and cons. The alternative to using an API is gathering the data yourself and putting it in your own database that your website accesses or your software accesses. This way, the whole rest of the web could basically go down, but your website might still be intact. But yes, when you are using someone else's API, if their website goes down, if their API goes down, then your site will go down or malfunction. And guess what? That happens all the time. That happens every day of your life to some really popular websites. You've probably encountered times where websites aren't working properly, even big websites like Gmail, Amazon, Twitter, things like that. Often that's because they're relying on various APIs that are down. So yes, with great power comes great, not responsibility, but yeah, that too. But also there are drawbacks to APIs. Other questions?
The data is dynamic though, typically, right? So we wouldn't have to keep updating our data to match. It sounds like you're saying anytime you load the page, it could be new data.
Yes.
If it's continuously being updated.
As long as the people who are working on that API are updating their data, every time I refresh this page, there will be new push pins, right? Because it's always grabbing it dynamically from that API. So if the city of Chicago is adding more potholes to their API, then as soon as I refresh my page, there will be more push pins. So it is dynamic in that way. Again, part of the power of the APIs. Again, it's also part of its drawback. If the city decides to stop updating their API, then the data that you grab from them is old, and you may not even be aware of it. Other questions? We're all good? Okay, think of questions. I'm going to give a just quick pitch, as I always do, for Actualize. If you can imagine that this is something you might love to do for a living because it's cool, fun, and lucrative as well, we do offer our Actualize online live program, which is a live part-time bootcamp that takes place over video conferencing where you learn how to do this stuff and become a professional software engineer. So our next cohort is starting very, very soon, starting on April 8th. So you could definitely check out our website at actualize.co and apply today if you're interested or seek more information. Absolutely. What on earth is going on?
Oh, what did I tell you, Jay? I told you not to take my sorting hat. Expelliarmus!
Oh. Okay, thanks a lot, Dumbledore.
Absolutely. Never take my hat. You learned your lesson.
This has gone haywire. I apologize on behalf of all of Harry Potter characters and myself and Albus D. Dumbledore. Any last questions before we sign off? I will email to all attendees the links from this video. I will also post this video to YouTube, to our YouTube channel. And if you want to share it with friends, family, please do so. And they can subscribe. And the next webinar will probably be in a couple weeks, 2 weeks. We try to do every other week. No more questions?
No.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of your night.